Nature of Society Part 5, Session 5R. Last week we began the topic of how site value taxation could be administered in any economy that wishes to transition into one that establishes a level playing field, and what the benefits of such an economic system would be. We established the definitions of the rental value of land and the market value of land, and how each could be measured and or calculated. We said that the land value was assessed based on assessment on several factors, such as location, natural resource content, presence of public utilities, and civil infrastructure, grading and natural drainage, aesthetics, air quality, and sunshine. The process was essentially the valuation of rights to possess and or use land sites, and must consider other kinds of rights such as water, riparian rights, mineral rights, timber rights, grazing rights, hunting rights, fishing rights, air rights, and access rights. It utilizes basic economic principles as the foundation for valuations, which we can now discuss. These economic principles were substitution, supply and demand, anticipation, and conformity. We went on to say that utility, scarcity, and desirability are the three ingredients that make land valuable. What do we make of all this during the week? Probably it may be necessary to have a look again at last week's session, as a lot was said. We then went on to list a few limitations of usership on anyone who purchases a lot of land, and these limitations were: 1. The payment of a land tax to provide revenue for public purposes; 2. Eminent domain where the government reserves the right to acquire; 3. Regulation, where the government reserves the right to regulate the use of the site for purposes of health, safety, general welfare, morals, building codes, zoning, sanitary regulations, and traffic regulations; and 4. Escheat, meaning the right of reversion of ownership to the Crown or state should the tax obligations not be met. What about these limitations? Did we find them to be unreasonable? We then had a discussion on the best use of land, and we said that site value taxation would encourage the best and most efficient use of land. We also said any land value assessment would be subject to appeal by an aggrieved party, and such an appeal commission would have the force of law behind it. The Land Bank and Exchange System, LBES, was then introduced as the system where landholders can sell and acquire parcels of land to carry out their economic activity, be it commercial, residential, industrial, agricultural, or recreational. The LBES will be on a digital online platform where all such transactions will take place, inclusive of payments of the SVT by landholders. We summarize the activities of the LBES as follows. 1. Inclusion of all site and land holdings, both in and out of use, and those sites that are underutilized. 2. Allow community members to identify and inquire into sites that are for sale, not in use, or underutilized. 3. Allow for the sale of sites to the LBES, the seller not being eligible for reacquisition for a specific time frame. 4. Allow for the payment of the annual SVT dues in installments if necessary, and inquire into arrears as well. We went on to say that with any land transaction, the obligation to pay the SVT, including arrears, will be the only qualifying criteria. Gone would be the days when a land transfer must take up a minimum of 90 days, as new site holders show their ability to meet the SVT, and they can then get on with the business of developing the sites. What are the comments regarding this innovation, the LBES. What are our comments? We then went on to list 8 disadvantages or misperceptions about SVT, which were as follows. 1. Poor widow objection. 2. Rising land values could force persons to move to certain areas. 3. SVT would lead to overdevelopment and loss of amenities. 4. Planners could increase site values artificially by rezoning. 5. It is unjust to tax in accordance with site value because it is potential values that are being taxed. 6. It would be difficult to establish the values of many sites. 7. SVT would not raise sufficient revenue. 8. SVT would transfer into higher rents and widespread price increases. In countering these misperceptions, we said that 1. The poor widow objection could indeed be raised for many taxes now existing, such as taxes on pensions, value-added tax, sales tax, custom duties, etc. Relocation of the widow or pensioner to an exclusive accommodation that is better than or at least equal to the existing, where the appropriate daycare, recreation, and living conditions are available for the incumbents. Or B, the families of these senior citizens can take over the management of these valuable sites and ensure that the tax is paid and the occupant satisfactorily cared for. Or C, deferment of the payment of the SVT until the occupant has passed on, but the accumulated taxes and interest be paid by the estate of the person or his heirs. Of the 3, the first option is most desirable because it would treat with a pressing social issue, which is the acceptable care of senior citizens. Regarding the second disadvantage, which is rising land values, we said that this could not be so dramatic as to a commensurate SVT burdensome. Although residential lands morph into commercial lands over time, this would hardly inconvenience residents with burdensome taxes, because SVT is a dynamic regime allowing resident persons to move to sites that meet their requirements, both aesthetically and economically. The increase in site values would benefit the community through the SVT, so the question of burdens should not arise. Regarding the third perceived value, disadvantage about the fear of overdevelopment and loss of amenities suggests that the community would be subjected to greater commercial construction, such as a proliferation of office blocks. This fear is unfounded because of the preeminence of planning regulations that would preclude this. These planning regulations would invariably align with site values and what they could realize, and these would be annually appraised. The 4th disadvantage listed was the view that planners could increase the site values artificially by rezoning. This is erroneous because planners usually enter the picture after the fact. Zoning or rezoning usually occurs after the site begins to exhibit a latent value that is higher than the current listed value. What SVT would mitigate is the possibility of landowners benefiting from any increase in land values that rezoning may bring about. The 5th perceived disadvantage was that SVT would be applied in relation to potential values rather than actual values. The main premise of SVT is that it is applying taxes in accordance with taxable capacity or values that could be realized. For instance, zoning restrictions which prescribe agriculture, industrial activity, commercial activity, residential and recreational activity will only be taxed in accordance with these usages and not otherwise. Activities that are out of sync with the zoning permissions will be taxed at the higher valued rate to encourage users to locate themselves in the permitted zones. As the zoning exercise will now be an annual one, development and redevelopment will not be stymied as public policy keeps in step with the development desires of the community. We didn't get past the fifth disadvantage on the last occasion, so that we now continue today with the last three misperceptions or disadvantages. The sixth misperception is that it would be difficult to establish the value of many sites. This is clearly not a valid misperception, as the determination of site values or market values take place daily throughout the realm. The seventh misperception is that SVT would not raise sufficient revenue. In the transition period, the need for relying on the traditional forms of taxation, albeit at a reduced level, would be necessary. But over the medium to long term, the SVT should be sufficient to meet all public expenditure. This is so because the state would have much fewer social obligations and needs for the provision of employment. The impact of inflation on the public expenditure that SVT will bring about will also be severely limited, so that the cost of goods and services will reduce substantially. The eighth misperception is that SVT would translate into higher rents and widespread price increases. This is the clear antithesis of all that has been discussed so far in this course. To explain in basic terms, a tax on land values is a tax on the rental value of land. And because this is to be applied across the board, the tax would fall not on the user, but on the owner of the site. This tax could not be passed on to the user, as is the case with traditional taxes, as the site would become uncompetitive. The price to occupy the site would reduce by the level of the SVT applied, and a buyer's market would ensue, as all unused or underutilized sites become available. In this scenario, higher rents and widespread price increases could not be the order of the day. Let's stop here for the break. What more can we say about all this? What are your comments and questions? We can now look at the acknowledged cons of the property tax that is in place around the world. Property tax, the acknowledged cons. There are many acknowledged drawbacks of the property tax regime that is so prevalent globally. Property taxes are usually based on a combination of taxes on land and buildings thereon. The 5 acknowledged drawbacks are: 1. Property taxes are not related to ability to pay. 2. Property taxes lead to lack of accountability. 3. Rateable values are usually hypothetical and out of date. 4. Property taxes penalize improvements. 5. Property taxes harm the economy. As we did above, let us look at each in turn. Regarding the first drawback, occupants of houses sited on lands of lower value often find themselves paying more property tax than those households located on higher valued lands, even if the building on each site are of similar value. This is because the weight of the tax is applied more on the buildings rather than on the land value. Certainly, a greater tax should be applied on the site value because the ability to pay is greater here than on a site of lower value. The second drawback, the lack of accountability with property taxes. This type of tax is easily passed on to the tenant, and the desire to have a fair share taxation policy is severely undermined and cannot be established and maintained. Inevitably, the poorer classes and those outside of the landowning class bear the brunt of these and other taxes because they can be simply passed on to them. The third drawback, that rateable values are hypothetical and out of date, is due to the onerous task of managing and maintaining this type of regime. The common perception is that valuations of property are determined quite haphazardly, and revaluation programs are quite cumbersome, onerous, and rare. Buildings are far more difficult to value than land and are also susceptible to disagreements. One can see why property revaluation exercises are irregular and out of date. The fourth drawback, that property taxes tend to penalize improvement to buildings, is without doubt. It is clearly a discouragement and disincentive to development, redevelopment, or improvement. It ignores vacant and underutilized valuable sites, but goes towards well-developed sites and penalizes any increases of property value without regard to impact. The impact is particularly negative at industrial and commercial sites, where there is the desire to improve and install new equipment, plant, and buildings, and these are met with increased taxes. We also observe that vacant factories, derelict sites, and obsolete buildings and machinery are ignored. All property taxes at commercial and industrial sites are also passed on to the consumer, and in times of downturn, when there is difficulty passing these taxes on, no improvement to these sites take place, to the detriment of the community. The fifth drawback makes the declaration that property taxes do unmitigated harm to the economy. Because these taxes are unfairly passed on to the consumers and tenants, in times of recession, these obligations may be difficult to meet, and defaults and evictions ensue. As lease agreements do not traditionally contain rent reduction clauses, and negotiations outside of these leases are rare, businesses either go under in this scenario or move to a cheaper location to the detriment of the neighboring community. We observe how widespread this phenomenon is during recessionary times. What have we to say about these cons? Have we noticed these in our communities? Take a look at these during the coming week and determine if they are valid and come back and report. We can now look at examples around the world where SVT is employed or proposed to be employed. Site value tax implementation around the world. There are some countries around the world that are using SVT, or at least partially using SVT. These countries and their specific areas implemented are as follows: Canada, Vancouver; Australia, New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, Queensland; the United States, Pennsylvania, Hong Kong, and Estonia. There are also several countries who have expressed a keen interest in implementing the policy: China, Ireland, Kenya, Namibia, United Kingdom, Scotland, Zimbabwe, Belgium, Ethiopia, South Africa, Thailand, Hungary, and South Korea. In those countries where it has been used, the implementation is only partial with many concessions and thresholds. The benefits to be had in such circumstances will only be partial, if at all. In these countries, the full import and understanding of what SVT brings is not known, and without this understanding, the ability to not concede to demand for concessions will not exist. Hence the reason for publishing this course, to increase this understanding. What the economists had to say about site value taxation. I end this session by reproducing here what the Economist, the well-known international magazine, had to say about the use of SVT in November 2014. Why land value taxes are so popular yet so rare. How should you tax wealthy landowners, homeowners? Britain's opposition Labour Party thinks it has an answer: an annual mansion tax on homes worth over £2 million. Meanwhile, the Scottish government plans to reform taxes on house sales. Yet in the discussion over property taxes, a favorite proposal of economists, a tax on the unimproved value of land, has been absent from the debate. Throughout history, economists have advocated such a tax. Adam Smith said nothing could be more reasonable. Milton Friedman said it was the least bad tax. Yet there are only a handful of real-world examples of land value tax, LVT. Why are they so popular yet so rare? When thinking about any tax, economists focus on how it affects decision-making. Income tax reduces the incentive to work. Corporation tax reduces the incentive to invest. Stamp duty deters some marginal house sales. Such prevention of mutually beneficial transactions is generally considered bad, though the deterrence of actions which hurt third parties, such as pollution, is an exception. Distributional effects also matter, although are often ignored on the assumption that any redistribution can happen through separate mechanisms. Land value taxation is so beloved of economists because, in theory, it does not distort decision-making. Suppose a land value tax of 1% on land value is introduced tomorrow. There can be no supply response. There would still be as much land as there is today. Neither would consumers' preferences change, as land would be no more useful either. So if the market for land is competitive, no transactions would be deterred or encouraged. All that changes is the price, which falls until it exactly offsets the discounted cost of paying the tax forever. The buyer assumes the burden of paying the tax, so all things considered is no better or worse off. Landlords are unable to pass the tax on to tenants because the supply and demand of rented land is unchanged too. Furthermore, if LVTs replaced property taxes, incentives against improving homes and developing land would be removed. Yet LVT would continue to account for undeserved gains landowners make on the investment of others, such as the government improving nearby transport links. This feature of the tax appealed to Winston Churchill. But if LVTs are so great, why are they so rare? One explanation is that it is too difficult to value land separately from what sits on it. There is not much of a market, for example, for undeveloped land in central London. However, some think this can be overcome. The 2010 Merle's Review of British Taxation argued that bean counters could compare the price of similar buildings in different locations, for instance. In any case, the efficiency of the tax does not depend on accurate valuations. The bigger barrier is political. LVTs would impose concentrated costs on today's landowners, who face a new tax bill and a reduced sales price. The benefit, by contrast, is spread equally over today's population and future generations. This problem is unlikely to be overcome. Economists will continue to advocate LVTs, and politicians will continue to ignore them.